The sky had turned a deep orange as Special Agent Tanya Wilson drove down the quiet suburban street. She rolled her shoulders, trying to ease the tension from a day spent poring over case files. Her team had finally tracked down the suspect in a money laundering operation after months of dead ends. All she wanted now was to kick off her shoes, pour a glass of wine, and call her mom with the good news. The flash of blue and red lights in her rearview mirror caught her by surprise. Tanya checked her speed. She wasn't going fast. She signaled and pulled over smoothly, reaching for her wallet where she kept her driver's license alongside her FBI credentials. Officer Derek Lawson sat in his patrol car for a long minute before approaching. He'd been on shift for 10 hours and had written up 17 tickets. This would be his last stop before heading back to the station. He walked toward the sleek black sedan, flashlight beam dancing across the vehicle's interior. "License and registration," he said flatly, not bothering with a greeting. His eyes narrowed as they settled on Tanya's face. "Good evening, officer," Tanya said with a polite smile. "May I ask why you pulled me over?" "Your right taillight is out," Derek replied, his tone suddenly shifting. He looked pointedly at her car, then back at her. "Pretty nice ride for." He stopped himself, but his expression said everything his words didn't. Tanya noticed the change immediately. She'd seen it countless times before, that moment when people made assumptions based solely on her appearance. She kept her voice steady. "I wasn't aware of the taillight. I'll get it fixed first thing tomorrow." As she handed over her license, she also reached for her FBI badge. "I should also let you know I'm a federal agent." Derek barely glanced at the badge before scoffing. "Yeah, right, and I'm the president." He handed the badge back without really examining it. Everyone's got fancy IDs these days. You'd be surprised what people can print at home. Tanya blinked, taken aback. "Sir, I assure you, I'm an FBI special agent. I just wrapped up a case at the downtown field office. You can call my supervisor to confirm." "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am," Derek said, his hand moving to rest on his belt. "Is that really necessary? It's just a taillight." "I said step out of the vehicle. Now." His voice had an edge that made the hair on the back of Tanya's neck stand up. Taking a deep breath, Tanya carefully opened her door and stepped out. The evening air felt suddenly cooler, or maybe it was the chill from Derek's stare. A car drove by slowly, the passengers watching with curious eyes. "How long have you owned this car?" Derek asked, walking around it with exaggerated inspection. 3 years, Tanya replied. "Must pay well, this FBI job of yours," he said with air quotes. "What is it you do exactly?" "I'm a field agent specializing in financial crimes," she explained, keeping her voice level despite the growing knock in her stomach. "I just closed a major case today, actually." Derek laughed. "Financial crimes, sure." He pointed to her taillight. "You know, people who respect the law tend to keep their vehicles in working order." A couple walking their dogs slowed down to watch. Tanya felt her cheeks grow warm with humiliation, but she kept her composure. Years of training had taught her how to stay calm in tense situations. "I understand, officer. Like I said, I'll fix it tomorrow." "Hands on the car, please," Derek instructed, ignoring her reasonable response. "Excuse me." "You heard me. I need to make sure you're not carrying anything you shouldn't be." Tanya's heart pounded in her chest. This was going too far, but she knew from both professional training and personal experience that arguing would only make things worse. She placed her hands on the hood of her car. "Is this really necessary?" she asked quietly. "Just following protocol," Derek replied with a smirk that suggested he was enjoying this far too much. "You'd know all about protocols if you really worked for the FBI, wouldn't you?" As more cars slowed to witness the scene, Tanya stared straight ahead, her reflection in her car's window showing a woman trying desperately to maintain her dignity while being needlessly humiliated on the side of the road. What should have been a quick traffic stop for a broken taillight was quickly spiraling into something much worse, and Officer Derek Lawson had no idea who he was really dealing with or what was coming his way. The sun had nearly set, casting long shadows across the roadside. Tanya stood with her hands on her car, acutely aware of the growing number of onlookers. A red pickup truck slowed as it passed, the driver craning his neck to see what was happening. "Spread your feet wider," Officer Derek commanded, his voice unnecessarily loud. He seemed to be performing for his audience now. You claiming to be FBI and all, you should know proper procedure. Tanya complied silently, her law enforcement training battling with her human instinct to defend herself. She had handled 10 standoffs with armed suspects, but this deliberate humiliation was testing her professional composure. So tell me about this big case you supposedly solved today, Derek said, drawing out his words as he circled around her. What was it? Shoplifting? Someone stealing cable TV? He laughed at his own joke. It was a money laundering investigation, Tanya replied evenly. 2 years of work. $15 million hidden through shell companies. Derek snorted. Right, and I'm about to win the lottery. He leaned in closer. Listen, I've been on this beat for 12 years. I know when someone's feeding me a story. A young couple had stopped walking their dog to watch. The woman whispered something to her partner, who shook his head with a troubled expression. My credentials are genuine, Tanya said. You're welcome to verify them with my field office. Oh, I'll verify something all right, Derek said. He pointed to the ground. You ever taken a field sobriety test before? Tanya's eyes widened. Officer, I haven't been drinking. Slurred speech, bloodshot eyes. Derek pretended to write notes. My speech is not slurred, and my eyes are fine, Tanya protested, her patience wearing thin. That's for me to determine. Derek pointed to a spot on the pavement. Walk in a straight line, heel to toe, now. The humiliation burned in Tanya's chest as she followed his instructions. She had spent years earning respect in a field dominated by men, only to be treated like a common criminal over a broken taillight. She walked the line perfectly, turned, and looked Derek in the eye. Satisfied? She asked. Now touch your nose with each finger, alternating hands, he ordered, ignoring her question. More cars slowed down. Someone had even pulled over across the street to watch. Tanya's cheeks burned as she performed the sobriety test she knew was completely unnecessary. Where'd you get this car again? Derek asked, running his hand along the hood of her sedan. Seems pretty expensive on a government salary. I've worked for the Bureau for 8 years, Tanya said, and I saved for this car. Derek walked around to her driver's side door, which still stood open. He peered inside, then reached for her purse on the passenger seat. Excuse me, Tanya said firmly. You don't have permission to search my vehicle or my belongings. Derek straightened up, his expression hardening. Are you telling me how to do my job? Because I could interpret that as interfering with police business. An older woman had stopped at the corner, her shopping bag clutched to her chest as she watched the scene unfold with worried eyes. I'm simply stating my rights, Tanya replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. As a citizen and as a fellow law enforcement officer. There you go again with that FBI nonsense, Derek said, his voice rising. You know what? I've had about enough. He grabbed his radio. Dispatch, I'm going to need backup for a possible DUI and resisting an officer. He stared at Tanya as he spoke, a smug smile playing at the corner of his mouth. This is absurd, Tanya said. I've complied with everything you've asked. I'm sober, and my FBI credentials are legitimate. Sure they are, Derek said, and that attitude right there, that's exactly what I'm talking about. People like you thinking you're above the law. People like me, Tanya repeated quietly. Derek didn't respond to her question. Instead, he reached for his handcuffs, the metal glinting in the glow of the streetlights that had just flickered to life. Turn around, he ordered. You're making this much harder than it needs to be. Tanya took a deep breath, weighing her options. She could see her phone on the passenger seat, just out of reach. One call to her supervisor would end this nightmare. But the look in Derek's eyes told her he was just waiting for a reason to escalate this further. This wasn't just about a taillight anymore, and they both knew it. The handcuffs felt cold against Tanya's wrists as Derek tightened them with unnecessary force. She winced but didn't give him the satisfaction of hearing her complain. This is completely uncalled for, she said, keeping her voice low and controlled. I need to make a phone call to my supervisor. Sure you do, Derek replied with a smirk. Everyone's got a supervisor they need to call. He turned her around roughly. Your supervisor can bail you out in the morning. Tanya glanced at her car, where her phone and FBI badge lay on the passenger seat. "Officer, just check my credentials properly. One phone call to the FBI field office will confirm everything I've told you." Derek ignored her request. Instead, he walked her toward his patrol car while speaking loudly enough for the growing crowd to hear. "You'd be surprised how many people think a fake ID and a good story will get them out of trouble." A middle-aged man who had been watching from his yard stepped forward. "Hey, is everything okay here? Seems like a lot for just a traffic stop." "Sir, please step back," Derek barked. "This is police business." "I'm just saying," the man began. "You want to join her?" Derek threatened, his hand moving to his belt. The man backed away, hands raised, but he pulled out his phone and started recording. Other bystanders followed suit, their phone cameras glinting in the darkness like fireflies. Tanya stood straighter, aware of the cameras. Maybe this wasn't all bad. There would be witnesses to Derek's behavior. Still, the public humiliation stung. 8 years of spotless service to the FBI, and here she was, being treated like a criminal over a taillight. "I need to call my supervisor," Tanya repeated, this time louder. "It's my right to make a phone call." "You'll get your call at the station," Derek said dismissively. He opened the back door of his patrol car. "Watch your head." As Tanya ducked to enter the car, she spotted her purse still sitting in her vehicle. "My purse. I need my belongings." "Evidence," Derek said with a shrug. "We'll catalog everything at the station." "Evidence of what?" Tanya asked incredulously. "A broken taillight." Derek slammed the door without answering. Through the window, Tanya could see him returning to her car. He reached inside and pulled out her purse, rifling through it without care. When he found her FBI badge and service weapon, his movements slowed. For a moment, Tanya thought he might finally realize his mistake. Instead, he secured her gun with exaggerated caution and pocketed her badge, a look of suspicion on his face. He grabbed her phone next, turning it over in his hands before shutting it off and dropping it into an evidence bag. The crowd had grown larger now. Some people were shaking their heads. Others were openly recording the scene. One woman was on her phone, gesturing animatedly as she described what she was witnessing. Inside the patrol car, Tanya took slow, deep breaths. Panic wouldn't help her now. She'd dealt with hostile situations during her FBI training. This was different, but the principles were the same. Stay calm, think clearly, and wait for an opportunity. Derek returned to the driver's seat, tossing the evidence bag onto the passenger seat. "Quite the collection of fake credentials you've got there," he said, adjusting his rearview mirror to look at her. "The gun is a serious offense, real-looking too." "It's real because I'm an actual FBI agent," Tanya said firmly. "You're making a huge mistake." Derek laughed, starting the engine. "Yeah, that's what they all say." As they pulled away from the curb, Tanya glanced back at her car, now lonely under the streetlight. Her case notes were still in the trunk. The team would be waiting for her report tomorrow. Her mother would worry when she didn't call tonight. "Listen," she tried one more time, leaning forward as much as the handcuffs would allow. "Just call the number on my badge. Ask for Assistant Director Thomas. Tell him Special Agent Wilson has been detained." Derek turned up the radio, drowning out her words. The station was only 15 minutes away, but sitting in the back of the patrol car, Tanya felt those minutes stretch endlessly. Outside the window, normal life continued. People walking dogs, couples holding hands, families driving home from dinner. None of them knowing that a woman's career and reputation hung in the balance because of one officer's refusal to listen. Derek hummed along to the radio, seemingly unbothered by the fact he had just arrested a federal agent. But soon, very soon, he would find out exactly who he had in his backseat. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed overhead as Derek led Tanya through the main entrance. Despite the handcuffs digging into her wrists, she walked with her head held high. Several officers looked up from their desks, curiosity in their eyes. "Got a live one tonight," Derek announced proudly, guiding Tanya toward the processing desk. "Claims she's FBI, had a fake badge and everything." A heavy-set officer at the desk looked up from his computer. "FBI, huh? That's a new one." He chuckled, reaching for a fingerprint pad. "I need to make my phone call," Tanya insisted for what felt like the 100th time. Contact Assistant Director Thomas at the downtown field office. He'll confirm who I am." The desk officer exchanged amused glances with Derek. "Yeah, we'll get right on that." Derek started filling out the booking paperwork with exaggerated thoroughness. Driving with a broken taillight, suspected DUI, though she refused the breathalyzer. "You never offered a breathalyzer," Tanya interrupted. "Because you know I'm not intoxicated." Resisting arrest, possession of a fraudulent federal ID, unlicensed weapon, Derek continued as if she hadn't spoken. A younger officer approached, peering curiously at Tanya. "What division of the FBI did you say you work for?" Before Tanya could answer, Derek cut in. "Don't humor her, rookie. This one's got quite the imagination." The rookie officer nodded and walked away, but not before giving Tanya a second look. Derek pulled Tanya's badge from his pocket, tossing it carelessly onto the desk. "Pretty good fake, though. Almost had me fooled for a second." The desk officer picked up the badge, examining it with more attention than Derek had given it. His expression shifted slightly. "This looks pretty official, Lawson." "They all do these days," Derek scoffed. "You can buy anything online." Across the room, the station's phone rang. A female officer answered it, listened for a moment, then looked directly at Tanya with widened eyes. She quickly covered the receiver and called out to the police chief, who was just emerging from his office. "Chief Patterson, you might want to take this call." The chief, a tall man with salt and pepper hair, took the phone. His casual expression quickly turned serious. He looked over at Tanya, then at Derek, his face growing darker by the second. "Yes, sir. Yes, she's here. No, I wasn't aware of the circumstances. I understand the seriousness. Yes, immediately." The chief hung up and marched directly toward the booking desk. "Lawson," he barked. "My office. Now." Derek looked up, confusion replacing his smugness. "Just finishing the booking paperwork, Chief." "Drop what you're doing. That's an order." The chief's voice left no room for argument. He turned to the desk officer. "Remove Agent Wilson's handcuffs immediately and bring her belongings." The desk officer hurried to comply while Derek stood frozen in place. "Agent?" "Chief, she was driving with a broken." "Now, Lawson." The chief cut him off. As the handcuffs came off, Tanya rubbed her wrists, relief washing over her face. The chief approached her, his expression apologetic. "Special Agent Wilson, I cannot express how deeply sorry I am for this misunderstanding." Derek's face paled. "Special Agent, but—" The chief silenced him with a glare. That was Assistant Director Thomas on the phone. Apparently, half the FBI field office has been trying to locate Agent Wilson for the past hour after she failed to check in. He turned back to Tanya. "Your colleagues were concerned when they couldn't reach you." The other officers in the station had stopped pretending to work and were openly staring now. Some looked embarrassed, others concerned. The rookie officer who had questioned Tanya earlier looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. The chief continued, "I've been informed that Agent Wilson is not only a legitimate FBI agent, but the lead investigator on the joint task force our department is joining next week." Derek's mouth fell open. His face, previously flushed with authority, now drained of all color. "The task force? She's the lead on—" "The money laundering case I told you about," Tanya finished for him, her voice calm but firm. "The one you found so amusing." The desk officer hurriedly returned with Tanya's phone, badge, and service weapon, handling them with newfound respect. "Agent Wilson will need a full incident report filed," the chief said. "And Officer Lawson, once you've had a chance to explain yourself to me, you'll be placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation." Derek stood speechless, the weight of his actions finally sinking in. As Tanya reclaimed her belongings, her phone buzzed with missed calls and messages. The tables had turned so completely it was almost dizzying. She looked at Derek, who couldn't meet her eyes. "I believe we have some paperwork to complete," she said, her professional demeanor fully restored. And then, "Officer Lawson and I have a lot to discuss about proper police procedure." Tanya sat in the police chief's office, a cup of coffee warming her hands. The leather chair felt too comfortable after the cold plastic of the patrol car's backseat. Chief Patterson paced behind his desk, his face still flushed with embarrassment and anger. "Again, Special Agent Wilson, I cannot apologize enough for what happened tonight." He stopped pacing and sat down heavily in his chair. "This isn't what our department stands for." Tanya took a sip of coffee before responding. "I appreciate that, Chief, but I think we both know this isn't just about tonight." Outside the office window, she could see Derek sitting at a desk, his head in his hands. The other officers gave him a wide berth, as if his mistake might be contagious. His confident swagger from earlier had completely vanished. "The videos are already online," said a woman standing by the door. She was Lieutenant Rivera, the chief's second-in-command, who had been quietly fuming since learning what had happened. She held up her phone, showing a social media page where clips of Tanya's roadside humiliation had already gathered thousands of views. The chief groaned. "This is a nightmare." "It's a nightmare that could have been prevented," Tanya said quietly. "Officer Lawson has a history, doesn't he?" The silence that followed confirmed her suspicion. Lieutenant Rivera finally spoke up. 3 complaints in the last year alone, all from people of color, all dismissed for insufficient evidence. Because it was his word against theirs, Tanya said, understanding immediately. The chief looked like he'd aged 10 years in the last hour. "The dash cam footage from tonight's incident has been secured, as has Officer Lawson's body camera." He hesitated. "We'll cooperate fully with any investigation the Bureau wants to conduct." A knock on the door interrupted them. Assistant Director Thomas from the FBI field office strode in, his face a mask of controlled anger. Tanya had never been so relieved to see her boss. "Agent Wilson," he acknowledged with a nod before turning to face the chief. "I've just spent an hour on the phone with the mayor and the commissioner. This incident has their full attention now." Outside the office, more activity stirred as news vans pulled up to the station. Word had spread fast, and the local media was already on scene. "Sir," Tanya began, "I don't want this to impact the Joint Task Force. The money laundering case is too important." Thomas shook his head. "The task force will continue, but with a different police department. I can't in good conscience ask my agents to work with an organization that allows this kind of behavior." The chief looked devastated. The Joint Task Force had been a major opportunity for his department, federal resources, positive press, career advancement for his officers. "What if this becomes a catalyst for change?" Tanya suggested, surprising herself with the words. Despite everything that had happened, part of her still believed in the system's ability to improve. Lieutenant Rivera stepped forward. "The Community Oversight Board I've been proposing for 2 years, maybe now is the time to implement it." As they discussed potential reforms, another commotion arose outside. Through the glass walls of the office, they could see a small crowd gathering in the station lobby. A middle-aged black woman pushed her way through, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on Tanya. "That's my neighbor, Mrs. Carter," Tanya explained. "She must have seen the videos online." 3 more people followed Mrs. Carter in, all residents from Tanya's neighborhood who had experienced similar treatment from Officer Lawson over the past year. "Looks like your Officer Lawson has made quite an impression on my community," Tanya observed. The chief rubbed his temples. "I'll speak with them personally." "We'll all speak with them," Lieutenant Rivera corrected him firmly. As the meeting wrapped up, Tanya gathered her belongings, exhaustion finally catching up with her. What should have been a simple drive home had turned into a departmental crisis and exposed a pattern of behavior that could no longer be ignored. Outside the chief's office, Derek was being escorted to turn in his badge and gun. His eyes met Tanya's briefly, a mixture of anger, embarrassment, and something else, perhaps the first glimmer of understanding that his actions had real consequences. Thomas walked Tanya to her car, which an officer had driven to the station. "You okay to drive home? I can have someone take you." Tanya shook her head. "I'm fine. It's been a long day, but I'd rather sleep in my own bed tonight." As she drove away from the station, the red and blue lights now reflecting in her rearview mirror for a very different reason, Tanya thought about the chain of events her broken taillight had set in motion. One small light had exposed something much bigger and much darker than anyone had expected. And this was just the beginning. 3 weeks had passed since that night, but it felt like 3 years to Derek. He sat alone in the back of the hearing room, watching as officers he had once called friends filed past without acknowledging him. The plastic chair felt uncomfortable beneath him, a far cry from the authority he had wielded so carelessly just weeks ago. At the front of the room, Chief Patterson conferred quietly with department lawyers. The table where Derek should have been sitting with his union representative remained half empty. The police union, typically quick to defend its officers, had distanced itself from this case. Indefensible was the word his union rep had used before suggesting Derek find private counsel. The door opened and Tanya Wilson walked in, dressed in a crisp navy suit. She carried herself with quiet confidence, nodding politely to several officers who had reached out to her after the incident. Behind her came Assistant Director Thomas and 2 other FBI agents. The room fell silent as they took their seats. "All rise," announced the clerk as the 3-person disciplinary board entered the room. Derek stood on shaky legs. His pressed uniform, once a source of pride, now felt like a costume he had no right to wear. The suspension had given him plenty of time to replay that night in his head, every bad decision, every moment when he could have stopped, listened, verified. But he hadn't. Why? The question haunted his sleepless nights. "Be seated," said the board chairwoman, a retired judge known for her fairness. "We're here today to review the conduct of Officer Derek Lawson on the night of April 15th and determine appropriate disciplinary action." The department lawyer approached with a USB drive. The board has been provided with Officer Lawson's body camera footage, his dash cam footage, and videos taken by 7 different bystanders. He inserted the drive into a laptop connected to a large screen. Derek clenched his jaw. He had seen the footage during his initial interview. Seeing it again, especially in a room full of colleagues, made his stomach turn. The video began to play. The sound of his own voice, arrogant, dismissive, mocking, filled the room. Several people shifted uncomfortably in their seats as they watched him force Tanya through unnecessary sobriety tests. When the video reached the part where he ignored her repeated requests to verify her credentials, a soft murmur of disbelief rippled through the audience. "We've also received 12 sworn statements," continued the lawyer, "from citizens who report similar interactions with Officer Lawson over the past 18 months. The chairwoman looked directly at Derek. "Officer Lawson, do you wish to make a statement before we hear from Special Agent Wilson?" Derek stood, his mouth dry. The speech he had rehearsed in his bathroom mirror for days now seemed hollow and inadequate. "I made a mistake," he began, his voice hoarse. "I should have verified her credentials. I should have listened." "Is that all?" asked the chairwoman when he fell silent. Derek looked at Tanya, then quickly away, shame washing over him. "No. The truth is, I saw what I wanted to see that night. I didn't see a federal agent. I didn't even see a person deserving of basic respect." His voice cracked. "I've had 3 weeks to think about why. And the only honest answer I can give is that I let my bias affect my judgment. I was wrong. Completely wrong." A heavy silence filled the room. This was not the defiant defense many had expected. The chairwoman nodded. "Thank you for your honesty. Special Agent Wilson, would you like to address the board?" Tanya approached the podium with measured steps. "What happened to me that night was humiliating and unjust, but sadly it wasn't unique." She turned slightly to look at Derek. "The only thing unique was that I had the authority and resources to ensure it didn't get brushed aside like so many similar complaints." She placed a folder on the podium. In this folder are statements from 28 citizens who experienced similar treatment but never filed formal complaints because they believed nothing would change. Officer Lawson is a symptom of a larger problem, a culture that allows certain officers to operate with impunity. The chief shifted uncomfortably in his seat as Tanya continued. "I'm not here today calling for Officer Lawson's termination. I'm here because this department needs systematic change, better training, real accountability, a functional oversight process." She looked around the room. "And most importantly, leadership that doesn't look the other way when officers like Derek Lawson show who they really are." Derek felt every eye in the room turn toward him. The weight of collective judgment pressed down on his shoulders. His career was over, he knew that. But somehow, at this moment, that seemed like the least of what he had lost. 6 months later, Tanya stood at the podium in the Police Academy auditorium, looking out at the sea of young faces in blue uniforms. Behind her, a large screen displayed the title of her presentation, "Building Trust." the foundation of effective law enforcement. She hadn't planned to be here. After the hearing that resulted in Derek's termination, she'd wanted to put the whole incident behind her. But when Chief Patterson personally asked her to speak to the new cadets about her experience, something told her this was important. Law enforcement isn't about power, she said, her voice carrying through the hall. It's about service. Every time you put on that uniform, you're making a promise to protect everyone in your community, not just the ones who look like you or live in certain neighborhoods. In the back row, Lieutenant Rivera nodded approvingly. Since the incident, she had been promoted to head the department's newly formed Community Relations Division. The oversight board that had just been talked for years was now a reality, with civilian members meeting monthly to review complaints and body camera footage. Some of you might be wondering why an FBI agent who was mistreated by a police officer would come here today, Tanya continued. The easy thing would have been to file my lawsuit, collect a settlement, and never look back. Many people told me to do exactly that. She clicked to the next slide, which showed a group photo of officers helping at a neighborhood cleanup event. But punishment without change solves nothing. What happened to me exposed problems that went beyond one officer's bias. It revealed cracks in a system that's supposed to protect all of us. A young cadet raised her hand. Ma'am, how did you stay so calm that night? I watched the videos in our ethics class, and I don't know if I could have kept my composure like you did. Tanya smiled slightly. Years of FBI training helped, but honestly, I was terrified and furious. I just knew that showing those emotions would make the situation worse. She paused. And that reality, having to manage an officer's potential reaction to my legitimate feelings, is part of what we need to change. Across town, Derek Lawson pushed a mop across the floor of a small convenience store. The name tag on his shirt read simply, Derek, no badge, no title, no authority. His police career was over, along with his pension and health benefits. The lawsuit settlement had taken most of his savings. The bell over the door jingled as a customer entered. Derek looked up and froze. Chief Patterson stood awkwardly by the door, plainclothes making him look older somehow. Didn't expect to see you here, Derek said quietly, continuing to mop. Didn't expect to be here, the chief replied. He glanced around the empty store. Got a minute? Derek propped the mop against a shelf. My break's in 10 minutes. But I guess the boss won't mind if I take it early. They sat on a bench outside, an uncomfortable silence between them. The department settled another lawsuit yesterday, the chief finally said. Got you pulled over last year. Same routine. Unnecessary sobriety test. Search without consent. Derek stared at his hands. Why aren't you telling me this? Because you're not the only one paying for what happened. The department's reputation, community trust, our budget, all taking hits because warning signs were ignored. The chief looked at him directly. I failed too, Derek. I saw the pattern in your complaints and did nothing. Derek had replayed that night with Tanya Wilson 1,000 times in his mind. Each time, he made different choices, better choices. But you can't change the past. I saw your ex-wife at the grocery store, the chief continued. She mentioned your boy is struggling with what happened. Derek nodded, his throat tight. Kids at school give him a hard time. His dad's that racist cop from the videos. That's tough, the chief said. But you know what might help? If he saw his father trying to make things right. How exactly am I supposed to do that from here? Derek gestured to the convenience store. The chief handed him a folded flyer. New Civilian Oversight Board is looking for community members. Even people with relevant experience, especially people who've learned hard lessons. Derek unfolded the paper, surprised. They'd never accept me. Probably not, the chief admitted. But applying would be a start, showing you want to be part of the solution.